This video, we will be learning how to play better chess by studying a game played by Capablanca. I think this game is amazing. There is so much we can learn from this, and it's especially the endgame, which is very important. So make sure you watch the entire game. Capablanca ended up getting a 98% accuracy in this game. So that just already tells us things are going to be quite amazing. So Capablanca was playing with the black pieces, and we are playing against the Queen's Gambit. Our opponent puts a pawn in the center, so we are just going to do the same. We are going to copy them. Then they play pawn to c4, attack the central pawn with the c pawn, so we are just going to protect it. I have studied many of Capablanca's games, and he pretty much almost always sets up this very specific structure when we are playing against the Queen's Gambit, which we are going to have a look at. And you might recognize this if you are a regular viewer of my channel. So white plays knight to c3, black plays knight to f6. And what we are basically doing this entire game is just trying to control the light squares in the center. That's very important here for the rest of the game. Both players are trying to have control over these light squares. White plays knight to f3 to develop, and Capablanca plays bishop to e7. Bishop to e7 is a very logical move in these positions, because most of the time white is going to pin your knight, so it's useful to already put your bishop here. And it ends up happening in this game as well. White plays bishop to g5, pinning that knight, but it's not really a pin anymore, because we already have our bishop in place. And Capablanca just castles, and white plays pawn to e3. This is one of those beautiful examples of how Capablanca just keeps the opening so incredibly simple. This is also what I recommend in every single video, to just keep it simple. Put a pawn in the center, protect it with another pawn, develop some pieces, and castle as quickly as possible. And then we are just going to play a middle game. And the middle game that we are going to play here is very interesting. This is very familiar to the opening that both me and Capablanca also play with white. I mean, I play it all the time, he plays it sometimes, which is to set up this knight on d2 as white, or this knight on d7 as black. And the plan behind this move is that we want to have more control over the e5 and the c5 squares. And this is how we are going to develop our knight. And you will see in a moment why this is a really useful move. White plays rook to c1, makes sense, because this file is very likely to open up, so those are the files where you want to put a rook. And in this position, black needs to find a way to develop more pieces, because that's all Capablanca really does. Just play principal moves, develop pieces, trade, and go for an endgame. We want to develop the bishop. We cannot develop it on this diagonal, so what should we do? We should play the move pawn to b6 so that we can put the bishop on b7 or maybe a6 in the future. So the bishop will be developing this way. White decided to capture in the center, and we need to take back. This is a good question. How do we want to take back here? Do you want to take with the pawn, or do you want to take with the knight? And one of those moves is right, one of those moves is completely wrong. If you take with the knight, white will capture your knight, and then we have a choice that we can make. We can either take here or we can take there, but for simplicity, I am going to start with taking in the center. What is the problem here that we have as black? Well, the bishop can take, and once we recapture, I hope that you see what the problem is. The problem is rook takes c7, and our queen was deflected. It was forced to move, and that caused us to lose a pawn, which was actually part of the trick why white put the rook on this open file. And it shows us why it's very useful to put the rook on the open file. Imagine that we have the same, but this time we try to take this bishop, right? That also seems possible, instead of recapturing this knight. Does this solve the problems? Not really, because now there is the move knight takes c7. We still lose a pawn, and the rook is under attack. So this was a very smart way of setting up a tactic by white, by playing the rook to the c file. But Capablanca saw all of this, and of course he took back with the pawn, which is also just very principled, because it's very important that you try to always fight for the center. And fighting for the center basically means you have to make sure you have a pawn in the center. And with the center, I mean these four squares. You want to have a pawn in the center. So this pawn is important, because the strategy for black, whenever you are playing against a d4 opening, the strategy for black should be to prevent the opponent from playing e4. That's just a very basic principle. And if you are playing against an e4 opening, the strategy for black should be to prevent the opponent from playing d4. At least that's the very basics of chess strategy. There are many openings that deviate from this as well. So that's why we play this. And here white plays queen to a4. And we always need to make sure what is our opponent doing? What are they actually trying to do here while they are attacking this knight? Okay, but it's all protected. So it doesn't really seem like a problem right now. So Capablanca just continues very logically, bishop to b7. This was our plan all along. Plus, this also helps with what I just said, that you always want to control the other square where there is no pawn yet, which is here the e4 square. And the opponent found a very interesting move here as white that I haven't seen much before. Bishop to a6. Basically saying, look, I want to eliminate your light squared bishop, and that way I am also going to gain back control at least a little bit over that e4 square. There is not much we can do here. We are basically forced to trade. Protecting it with the rook is not great, because you end up in this strange position with the rook. Then the queen goes to the c6 square. Like the pawn is blocked, and we never want the c pawn to be blocked. This is very important because we will need the c pawn to counterattack in the center. So we are basically forced to capture, which is what Capablanca played, and then white recaptures with the queen. So the strategy that we use here for black is incredibly simple. We just fight for the center, we develop the pieces. So the real question is, how can we try to fight against the center? And as I said before, that basically means how can we attack the pawns in the center, try to get rid of them? Well, that is the move c5. And that is why we played that move knight to d7 as well. One, so we could protect this. And also, in case they take the knight, which is what happened on the next move, we always have a piece to recapture. And it's important that we always keep an eye on this e4 square, because we basically never want white to be able to push e4. So that's the big strategy you need to follow here when you are playing against a d4 opening. White decided to grab the pawn on c5. And this is again a very, very interesting moment, which really shows how well Capablanca understands endgames and how well he understands pawn structures. Because all you should really do to win chess games and to play in this style is just keep things simple. Develop pieces, fight for the center, and we want to prepare for the endgame. So keeping all of that in mind, the question I will ask is, how should we recapture this pawn? Should we recapture it with the bishop, or should we recapture it with the pawn? Wow, very good question. If we recapture it with the bishop, what happens? They will probably castle. And then we need to have a look at this position, because we are basically saying, hey, this is the endgame that we are going to play. Why the endgame? Because, well, very soon the last pieces will be traded and this will be the endgame. And in the endgame, the main thing that you need to keep in mind is this idea of pawn islands. What does that mean? So we have this pawn island, meaning they are connected. They can possibly work together. We have this pawn island, and then we have this one. So we basically have 3 pawn islands, and one of them, this one here, the blue one, is also isolated, meaning it cannot be protected by any other pawns. And an isolated pawn is not something that you want to have in the endgame, because since it cannot be protected by any other pawns, white can keep attacking it with pieces, so we will either need to play very defensively. It's also on a light square, which the bishop can actually not protect, so we might even be losing that pawn. So instead, we take with the pawn here. And you might be thinking, like, wait a minute, don't you still have 3 pawn islands? You have this one, you have this one, and you have this one. Yes, that is completely true, but at least we don't have an isolated pawn in the center. We do have an isolated pawn here, but it's not really a problem because it's not going to be easy for white to attack it, and it's also on a dark square, which means it's going to be easier to protect. And I think the move that Capablanca played here was very genius, and this really shows how well he understands the endgame. The question is, how can we try to get 2 pawn islands again instead of 3? What move could we play? Well, it is the move queen to b6. Because queen to b6 attacks the queen, it also attacks this pawn, so yeah, white really has to do something here, and if they take, they are basically helping us. Because now they fixed our pawn structure, we only have 2 pawn islands, we also have an open rook, so this would be amazing. The opponent didn't take, instead they played queen back to e2, because this also protects the pawn, and it doesn't help black to improve the pawn structure. So very important for your own games as well, to keep in mind what we just talked about the pawn islands, and basically you should try to have the least amount of pawn islands possible. Having 1 is best, having 2 is okay, having 3 can lead to trouble, but if you have 3, make sure at least it's not an isolated pawn in the center. Okay, so what are we going to do here for the endgame plan? This is where the game gets incredibly interesting and where we are going to have an amazing tactic. What's the plan here for black? Well, the question is always, what is our biggest strength in the position? And our biggest strength is, one, that we have these 2 pawns, because we have more pawns in the center than the opponent. And a second advantage that we have, an imbalance, this is called, meaning a difference in the position, is that we have a knight and a bishop against 2 knights. So whenever you are trying to find a good move, all you need to do is think, what are the imbalances in the position? What are the differences? And Capablanca was thinking here, what are the differences? Well, I have better pawns in the center. I have a bishop. Okay. What does my opponent have? They have control over this file. That's their biggest strength, I think. We don't really have control yet. So what move could we play here? Capablanca plays the move c4, which is incredibly interesting. What does this move accomplish? Well, first of all, we take away a square from the enemy queen. They can never play queen d3 anymore. The second thing we do is, by pushing the pawn, we now have this structure with this protected pawn on c4, which limits the power of the rook. Otherwise, we would always need to keep an eye on c5. Now we don't. And this also opens up the diagonal for the bishop. The bishop, which we just mentioned, is one of our advantages that we have, the fact that we still have a bishop. This move, however, also has a downside. The downside being that we have a backward pawn, meaning a pawn that is not protected by any other pawns because they have moved too far up the board. It's a little bit like an isolated pawn. This one is not isolated, it still has a buddy here, but it cannot be protected itself. The question is, of course, is that a problem? Well, not really, because we are going to use a knight and a rook to protect it. White is going to use a knight and a rook to attack it. And that's basically pretty much where it ends. There is not really a way for white to win the pawn. So white realized this, and they played the move knight to d4, which is a good move because they are taking a very good square for the knight, an outpost square, a square where the knight is supported by a pawn and it can no longer be attacked by any other pawns. We on the other hand, we get this diagonal for the bishop, so we can play the move bishop to b4. And white tries to fight back against our pawns by playing the move pawn to b3, which immediately threatens to win a pawn. If we don't do anything, let's say that we just play a random move, like we move this pawn here, white will just take, and they will be winning a pawn. So we need to do something about this, but the good thing is, of course, we still have that second rook that we can use. And slowly, move by move, Capablanca is creating a winning endgame here, which is what I think is the most interesting part of this game. Because right now, if I ask the question again, what are the imbalances? Well, the rooks are actually equal now. Our bishop has improved. Our pawns are more centralized and better placed than the opponent's pawns. White captures on c4, we recapture, and the downside of this trade for black is, again, what we talked about, pawn islands. We have more pawn islands, so the pawns might be weaker, which means they might be lost. On the other hand, we have a pawn that's 3 squares away from promotion, and it's a passed pawn, meaning there are no other pawns that can stop this. So a passed pawn in the endgame is always incredibly important. As soon as you have a passed pawn, the main strategy should be, how can I promote it? We don't want white to have a bunch of pieces in front of the pawn. That's annoying, so we are going to start eliminating them. Bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, and then knight to d5, attacking the rook. Because what we really want to achieve is we want to push, we want to move the pawn forward. And that's a very huge rule you need to follow. Whenever you have a passed pawn, you just need to push it as long as you don't immediately lose it. Because every move you get closer to the edge of the board as a move closer to promotion, which increases the opportunity for tactics to happen in the position. Plus, every move we make is also a square we take away where white can no longer put its pieces. So what we see here is very simple. Black has created a passed pawn and is trying to promote, and white is trying to stop the pawn from promotion and also trying to win the pawn. So that's the question. Will black be able to promote, or will white be able to stop the pawn? Okay. Here Capablanca played a rook to c5, which makes a lot of sense because that way we could try to double up the rooks. Another move that you might actually consider is something like moving the queen. For example, I think queen to d6, trying to see if we can do anything on this file as well. But I think rook to c5 also makes a lot of sense. White here starts a very funny sequence, I think. I think this is one of the funniest things I have seen in a while. White says, no, I won't just let you double rooks. I attack your rook, so you have to move back. Okay, says Capablanca, I move back. White says, well, if you want to repeat moves, we can repeat moves, right? You can just go back and forth. We just repeat. We would have a draw. That would be fine. Capablanca says, no, I don't want to have a draw, so I'm going to play rook c7. So basically all that happened is because of, instead of c5, or rook is just on c7, and for the rest the position did not change. But white says, no, I still want to attack your rook. So I'm going to attack your rook again. And I'm not only going to attack your rook, I'm also going to attack your pawn, which means that once you move the rook, I will have 3 attackers on this pawn. And this was actually a genius, literally a genius maneuver by Capablanca. I cannot stress this enough. You are going to see right here why this is so genius. Because this pawn is poison. It's poison. White cannot take this. If white takes the pawn, it's instantly game over. And the best thing for white to do is actually to just go back. But we basically achieved what we wanted. We can now double up the rooks, and white just wasted a bunch of moves moving back and forth the knight. But that pawn being poisoned, the fact that Capablanca was able to calculate this is quite amazing. This pawn is poisoned. What problem does white potentially have in this position, and black actually as well? The problem is a weak back rank. You might get back rank mated. Both of us might get back rank mated. But that's a bigger problem for the person who is trying to fight against the passed pawn. And the opponent here took the pawn, which is instantly game over by a beautiful sequence. If you want to calculate and pause, you can. I honestly don't think anyone is going to find it. It's quite amazing. Knight takes c3. Rook takes c3. So far, I think this looks logical. Rook takes c3, rook takes c3. And this still looks logical. But then here in this position, black has a winning move. And this one, I think more people will be able to find if you use quite a lot of time. There is a move here that wins the game. The only move that wins the game is this amazing move, queen to b2. Chess.com says this is a good move. I don't agree. I think it's a brilliant move. So I will turn this into a brilliant move for Capablanca. Why is this move so brilliant? Well, we have to evaluate every option. First of all, we attack a rook and a queen. If they take our queen, that's just a back rank mate. So that doesn't work. Okay, well, you might think maybe they move the queen and they protect the rook. But that doesn't work because we take the rook and they cannot capture. Otherwise, it's also a back rank mate. So basically, they just drop a rook. So they cannot take our queen. They cannot go back and protect the rook. If they go queen to c2 to protect this, there is the move queen a1, check, queen blocks, and then rook d1 with a check. Queen has to take, and that's also a checkmate. So basically to show the queen cannot protect the rook. And of course, if you go here, it's even, well, actually here is interesting as well. We have this check, and then they have to block with the queen, but that's not a checkmate, but they do lose the queen, and then they also lose the rook on the next move. So basically, the queen cannot protect the rook. The queen needs to move, and the rook is hanging. So what you could consider is king f1, but then you lose your rook. So the final move, which I found the most complicated one, this was the one why I didn't completely see the tactic immediately, is I was thinking, white just has rook c2. And the rook c2 attacks the queen, and it protects the queen, and everything is fine. And we don't have a back rank checkmate because they take. But we still have a winning move. Queen b1. Queen b1 is a check. If they block with the rook, of course, they lose the rook. And if they block with the queen, they also lose the rook. And the brilliant thing here is that from our beginning position, right here, the move queen b1 actually doesn't work. Because white plays this. And we cannot try to go and win the queen because we would be back rank mated ourselves. So it actually doesn't work. And yeah, we could win the pawn maybe. That would be something. We could win a pawn. But it doesn't really work. But playing this move first makes it work because if they play rook c2, then you have queen b1. And the opponent here just immediately resigned after the move queen to b2. I hope you enjoyed this game. Make sure to subscribe for more videos.